When the well-respected British arts journalist visiting a New York City gallery, one known for exhibiting African photographers' work, was introduced to me, his response was not, "Nice to meet you." It was, "Oh, I'm not going to remember that." I responded, "I'm not going to remember your name either." He looked sufficiently perturbed. Then there was the South African administrator in the arts department at Stellenbosch University, who is now at an even higher post at the University of Cape Town. She was asked to introduce me at an international conference, one meant to question unequal distributions of power, erasures of colonial bodies, and structures meant to maintain less powerful groups behind visible and invisible barriers. She got up on the podium and said, "Yeah, I can't say it," and looked exasperated with me for having such a difficult name. And just a week ago, a colleague at my home university in New York introduced me to her husband at a housewarming party for another colleague. "This is Neelika. I can't say your last name." Again, the exasperated look, the dramatic gesture. That second part of her introduction was wholly unnecessary. It accentuated my otherness and marked her own subjectivity as the norm. She was not required to bother to learn my name or find a creative way of not having to say it. It required that I laugh and make a creative little joke about not being able to pronounce her Italian-American surname either, although I can. I'm just as guilty. Recently, whilst I was viewing a show at a Cape Town gallery, I mixed up the name of artist and curator Sisipo Ngodwana with the name of her colleague Sinazo, to whom I'd just been introduced. Now, I'd met dozens of new people that week, and it was an honest mistake. But my mistake sat with me on the plane back to New York. When I returned, I sent her a note of apology with no qualifications or excuses. She was gracious. We were able to have a conversation about how both of us have dealt with these moments of erasure. Or as she said, we usually brush off these encounters because people not only violate you, but they also train you to be accepting of violence. Although my parents were born and brought up in Sri Lanka, I was raised and educated in Zambia. My father was educated in Moscow during the Khrushchev years when two powerful nations were vying for the Third World's attention, hearts, and minds. But because his degree was worth little outside of Soviet-friendly nations, he was not able to get a job in England, where many ambitious young men from the so-called Commonwealth immigrated. When I was worried about my own job prospects, he told me an apocryphal story. In 1971, he sent applications for jobs in Southern Africa, including one to what later became the Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines. But it was only 8 years later that he heard back from them, when the mines changed their policy about not hiring non-white expatriates. Because of this sudden change in a racist policy, I grew up in Zambia with children whose names reflected complex personal geographies. Subsequently, I went to the United States for university, buoyed by my father's hopes and dreams. I now teach literature at a university in a rural part of New York State and travel often to South Africa for my own work as an arts writer. My name, including my clan name, get ready for it, is Jayawardane Arachige Manori Neelika Jayawardane. Not all the history that comes with that name has been honorable or good, but it is mine. Not all the history in a name is ever good or honorable. However, I'm better able to shape my future because I know where I came from. My name's roots are in Pali, an ancient Indo-Aryan vernacular dialect, For those who are not familiar with South Asian languages, the phonemes common to Pali present difficulty. Knowing this, I usually map out the syllabic breaks and stresses for my American university students, who, though they pronounce my name hilariously and badly sometimes, always make the respectful attempt. But that's because they know there's a difference in power between us in a classroom. I make sure they know that. However, when I travel, when my body is and person is in transit, I don't have that protection. Living a life out of place meant that I became an adept negotiator between cultures and languages. I'm always answering questions about my otherness, laboring to ease my complexity for those who believe their stability, the gift of having been born within networks of power, was the norm. On some occasions, my movement away from my family's home location enhanced my subjectivity, especially as I began to travel with a modicum of power. Power achieved through education, a green card and now citizenship connecting me to a politically powerful country, or networks of support that recognized and respected my difference. But more often, I experienced dislocation. To deal with those moments, I developed good humor. But I also learned how to set boundaries, to know when good humor has become a coping mechanism to deal with painful moments of exclusion and erasure. To recognize when being funny is about accepting too little, playing along as the good black, the model immigrant, the nice native, making things easy for the dominant group. That negotiating the minefield of difference levies a psychological, mental, and physiological tax that left me intellectually exhausted and emotionally broke. I learned that being funny is labor that compensates for the work that persons belonging to the dominant group do not have to do and does not want to do. Many of us have a version of a many-nationed narrative. We became travelers and explorers because ambition pushed us to, and because impossible political, economic, and environmental realities forced our hand. We mobilized ourselves through worlds that actively resisted our entry. And now we find ourselves living and working in locations where our names and our cultural histories are unfamiliar, with people who do not necessarily regard us as worthwhile enough to pronounce. Most of us who have experienced lives marked by our racial, ethnic, or linguistic otherness brush off an incorrect pronunciation. Though sometimes hilarious mispronunciations are part of our everyday, it's a negotiation we've come to expect and for which we prepare ourselves because dominant groups don't question what their privilege and power allow them to get away with. Difficulty is the alibi that we most often use for not attempting to learn someone's name. That refusal to even attempt to pronounce the other is, of course, a one-way privilege. That refusal irks me. Another one of the luxuries of being a part of power is in assuming that the other must educate and explain. I'm often expected to do the uncompensated labor of educating people about my personal immigration history, as well as my name, whether I find myself in one of those horrendous after-work parties, which we've all experienced, or trying to share a lap lane at the pool with a strange man, or naked and sweating in some sauna. That's really happened. For that reason, one of my friends, Sophia Azeb, who is Palestinian Egyptian and now works at New York University, prefers to let people mispronounce. Her name begins with a voiced epiglottal fricative or trill. She says she often dumbs it down to Azeb or Azeb to avoid being asked 3,000 times to repeat it so someone else can practice saying it. Because the labor that's necessary to teach others to pronounce her name, she says she actually prefers it to being consistently mispronounced than feeling pressure to educate strangers on how to articulate a sound that exists only in a handful of global languages. When we articulate a name, we are hailing the person to whom that name belongs. To hail someone is to recognize her person fully, We are recognizing an entire worldview that comes with those phonemes. We are calling out to the ancestors that cultivated the sonic landscapes of her personhood, the word culture that shaped her ways of being in the world, and the future she dreams of fashioning. In my home culture in Sri Lanka, we are named using the phonemes that an astrologer determines at our birth will attract good energy and fortune into our lives. My colleague Palesa Motsumi tells me that in Sesotho culture, we are named often after our forefathers as well as according to the events taking place during a birth. There is a ceremony done to welcome the child into this earthly life and to inform our ancestors about the new member of the family. In this way, we acknowledge many lives through naming. Names can even map out the ways in which the bearer's future lies. When we are asked to flatten out our names, we're being asked to compact and reduce rich layers of context that are embedded in us. We are being asked to make ourselves simpler, more digestible for those who do not want to deal with complexity or difference. It means we are seen as something that remains so other that we remain unpronounceable. And we comply out of necessity to ease our passages in the world. Pronouncing a name or choosing not to is indicative of whether people are willing to be respectful of our integrity in other ways too. It speaks miles about whether they want to develop a relationship with us and our work, rather than reshape us into easy-to-consume commodities. As a person who is clearly marked as a racialized subject, as an other who finds myself often in transit, I now specifically ask those I encounter to make a respectful attempt, if not a perfect one, to pronounce my name. This may be a symbolic act, but it is an important step in setting expectations and boundaries for how we will subsequently encounter each other. Sometimes people are not going to like you for having a clear sense of limits, so expect resistance. Or scoffing when you articulate limits and expectations about labor, compensation, or how to behave respectfully towards one's work and one's own person. Expect pushback, especially if you're a woman, a black woman, and an artist. Expect to get a reputation. But expect also to have a dignified relationship with yourself. Expect to hold your head as you wish to when you walk into your future, rather than have others turn it where they wish for it to go or push it down to indignity. We still hear conflicting messages about Africa. Either we are Africa rising, a useful commodity, or Africa still dysfunctional, Africa to be saved and conquered. What's true is that those of us who have ties to African landscapes are now more in charge of how we construct ourselves. As we enter the multi-billion-dollar industry that is the art world, it is imperative that artists, writers, and curators set their own limits and boundaries that will help us maintain our self-respect and dignity. For an art professional working with African and diasporic artists, not pronouncing respectfully means that one is not accurately engaging in the necessary discourse. For a collector, it means that they have not created as fulfilling and rich a relationship with the aesthetic works in which they have invested financially as they could. We now have an opportunity to think about how cultural producers and artists of our time might reframe erroneous but powerful mythologies about Africans. Those reductive narratives about us are not going to change if we dumb down what we call ourselves and succumb to someone else's arrogance, which demands a more palatable version of our persons. It's more important that we challenge the powerful desires and motives of the market rather than have the market reduce how we are seen. We should roll out into the world with all the complexity of our names and our beings and the histories that created those beautiful and painful sounds that resonate within us.